So good day, everyone. My name is Brian Prophet, and I'm welcoming you to a special edition of Community Central. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, who will be talking about language and nomenclature in and around open source communities. Before we do that, I want to get to some quick housekeeping notes. Some of you have already noticed that we're doing this in a new format. We're going to try to do it in regular Blue Jeans, which will allow a more personal discussion as we get to the Q&A part of the session later on. Let's try this. If you have a question, I need you to virtually put your hand up in the chat at the time you think of your question. You don't necessarily have to do the question in chat. Just get your hand up in some way. When Rich is finished with his presentation, we will go through and answer the questions in the order in which they were received until we finish up at 11:30. We will be stopping at the half-hour mark to make room for another presentation related to this, which we'll be talking about at the end of this session. So without any further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Rich Bowen, Community Architect with the Open Source Program Office. Good morning, Rich. How are you?
Doing great, Brian. Thanks so much for giving me this stage. I'm going to dive right in because we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to be talking about choosing nomenclature carefully in your software and documentation. So I have to start right up front with a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is, of course, what you see in this picture here. I'm a white, middle-aged, bearded man with a good job living in suburbia. So what can I possibly tell you about this topic? And my answer to this question is the part of this presentation that I hope you retain as the rest of it fades. And that is that I read and listen to minority voices, and I believe them when they tell me that their experience in life is different from mine. And I know that that might come across as pretentious or self-congratulatory, and that's because it's aspirational. This is something that I strive to achieve every day. And as I fit in all those categories that I just told you about, it's something that I have to focus on every day. So if you remember one thing about the presentation, remember this: read minority voices, listen to minority podcasts, listen to Emmanuel Acho's video series if you haven't already. I'll provide a link for that later. Listen more than you speak. If you have questions, read some more. Be uncomfortable, deal with it. I know that I cannot change the world, but I can use the influence and privilege that I have to change my small part of it. So let's jump in with what it is that I'm talking about. This past weekend, I saw this tweet. I refuse to use whitelist and blacklist or master and slave terminology for computers. Join me, words matter. And the what here, the call to action is the easy part. Stop using the term blacklist in your software. Stop using master and slave terminology. Choose something else that makes sense in your particular context. So that's the what. The why is perhaps the harder part. There's two main reasons here. And the one that we're kind of focusing on today is this second one. Being told, subtly or not so subtly, multiple times every day, that a part of your identity, blackness, is a metaphor for bad, reject, deny. That feels awful. And we want to create welcoming communities. It's also better for understanding if you use things that directly describe your software, rather than trying to rely on a metaphor that may not translate well into other cultures and contexts. So those are the two main reasons. And after reading this tweet last weekend, I took the step to remove this terminology from everywhere in a project where I have influence, and that's the Apache web server. And the Apache web server no longer uses this terminology anywhere in our documentation. Later on in the weekend, I guess it was Monday morning, I saw this tweet from another friend of mine, Sebastian Bergman. He's very influential in the PHP project. And he said that he was going to be doing the same thing in the next release of his software PHP unit. This is the standard testing infrastructure for the PHP programming language. This is a pretty influential piece of software on the internet. Now, after doing these things, if you go back and read these tweet threads, you will see a lot of objections to making this change. And the objections fall into a number of broad categories, and that's going to be the bulk of what I'm talking about, because these objections tend to be raised by well-meaning people who don't understand why you're doing this and why it matters. And almost all of these arguments are true. They have truth behind them, but they miss the underlying point. And it's important to know how to respond to these things if we consider this to be an important thing to do. So here's the most common objection that you will find when you advocate for removing these sorts of words from documentation, from your software. The first answer is that that's not what those words mean, which is true. People will say, historically, blacklist is a term that was coined in 17th century English and had nothing to do with skin color. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But I would have two answers to this. One of them is that language evolves. This is how language works. My brother's a linguist, and we have this argument frequently about whether words mean what they mean or whether they mean what they're used to mean. And words evolve over the centuries. Very few of us were alive in the 17th century, or we were very young at the time. Another example that I like to give is the word awful, which means inspiring reverence and awe. And it's a very positive term. And of course, it doesn't mean that anymore. Words evolve. And the other reason is that words mean visceral things to some people that they might not mean to you, as I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. Imagine if you had in your office chair spring poking you in the back, and all day, every day, you had this little irritation. That's what these words are like. They are a constant reminder that a part of your identity is associated with badness. Now, another famous American, Muhammad Ali, used his platform of influence to get this point across in the late 60s. And if you Google Muhammad Ali black and white, you'll see him giving this analogy. He talks about why was angel food cake always white and devil food cake always black? And he presents this in a humorous way, but it's a very serious point that he's making. I would encourage you to look that up. And again, I have a link at the end of the presentation to that. Or if you look in the bottom right corner of my slides, there's the URL for my slides. So the next objection that you will find is people saying, it just seems unnecessary. These words are not offensive to me, and so I don't care. The old words work well, and they're the ones we've always used. This is a waste of time. What's important to remind people that are making this objection is that it's not about them. It's not about their offense. It's not about their hurt feelings. This is a larger issue. We are trying to build communities that are more welcoming, that are more that don't tell people that they are less than. When people tell us that words hurt, it's our job to believe them. It's not our job to argue with them and say, well, I don't feel hurt. It's our job to believe people when they tell us. And frankly, in an open source project, it's my time to waste. I get to choose how I spend my time on open source projects. So people telling me not to waste my time doesn't carry a lot of weight with me. The next again, legitimate objection that people make is that folks are going to have to relearn. They are going to have to learn new configuration directives. They're going to have to learn new terminology. They're going to have to figure out what all of these fancy new words mean. And I once again say that this is almost never actually true. Think about your job where you're configuring a piece of software and a configuration term changes to a new term. That might be irritating the first time or two, but you'll get over it. You'll remember that. And what we're recommending here is that people choose terms that make more sense in context anyway. So rather than saying blacklist, which is a linguistic metaphor, instead we use a term like deny list, which says what it does. Most of the projects where this is a big deal, for example, Spam Assassin is going through this process right now. And as you can imagine, Spam Assassin has blacklist as a major part of its terminology. And so they are building in a deprecation cycle. So you're actually going to have a year where when you use the old terms, you'll get a subtle warning, but it'll still work. And so I think that all of us can manage to learn a new term in a year. And, frankly, if this inconveniences you, that might be an opportunity to reflect about the inconvenience that is placed on other people. This argument, the next argument that you'll hear is one that I don't have a lot of time for, but it is one that I hear greatly. This is the slippery slope argument. This is, if you change this thing, you're going to have to change that other thing and that other thing and that other thing, and it never ends. There's no end to it. Earlier this week, somebody told me, well, if you change that word, then you'll also have to replace server and client because those are offensive to a certain category of people. Well, it turned out as the conversation went on that this individual was being sarcastic to make a point that this is all silly and a waste of time. And what my typical response to this is to actually take them seriously, even when I know they're being sarcastic, and say, look, if that is a term that you find people being upset about, then maybe that's your opportunity to think through whether that's worth your time to change. And this invariably leads to questions as to whether we should rename the Black Sea and whether the term blackmail is offensive. And those are simply outside of the scope of where I have influence. I can only influence the world in my little sphere. And so I feel like these things are kind of a distraction away from the main point. But I do want to, I had this conversation on Twitter, and arguing with people on Twitter never ends well. But this was a moment of clarity to me. This person said that eventually this becomes a ceaseless cycle of making changes to everything that causes slight discomfort. And it occurred to me that that's kind of the definition of kindness, that you listen and you believe people when they tell you that things cause discomfort, and you try to adapt to that. And if you have to explain to people why compassion is important, then maybe that conversation has reached its logical conclusion. Another thing that you will hear frequently, particularly in the open source community, is that people are too thin-skinned. People should be willing to accept a little bit of offense. They need to have a thicker skin to work in open source. You will hear this constantly across all of open source, that people are just too thin-skinned, and maybe if they can't deal with a little offense, they shouldn't be here. And yeah, some people are too easily offended. That's certainly the truth. But surely, if we are trying to build inclusive, vibrant communities, making that road a little smoother is a reasonable goal. If you can make a change in your software that costs you very little and makes that road smoother for somebody that's trying to join your community, I think that's worth it. And I hope you agree with me. People will always find another thing to be offended about. The words that we're talking about today were perfectly acceptable 20 years ago. But to put that in context, 20 years ago, there were other words that we were dealing with that were far more offensive, and that battle is not won yet. So I'll remind you that language evolves. Words change meaning over the years. And if we are communicators, so I'm a documentation guy. I've been writing documentation my whole open source career, and communication is my job. And as a community manager, communication is my job. And so it's my job to listen to people and try to speak to them in a language that is welcoming and that is going to make them feel like they're part of us, that they're not the other. Now, most of our communities are international and multicultural, and we are at a point in US history right now that the whole world is sharing in. But frequently when I talk about nomenclature in documentation, and I've been having this conversation for 20 years at least, very frequently what I hear is that is a US-centric, culturally specific problem that you're dealing with and doesn't affect the rest of the world. And, you know, that's certainly true in many cases. The issue is very different in Africa. The issue is very different in Asia. But in both of those cases, in all of these cases, I still think that there's a benefit in using words and phrases that describe what your software is doing rather than relying on metaphor. And if that, as a side effect, helps a few people to feel more welcome, that's just gravy in those cases. Now, I've heard this argument a surprising number of times this week, that by calling out the use of the word slave in documentation, you're merely reinforcing that this has a negative connotation. And you know, there's again some truth to this. There's an article on CNET today that refers back to that tweet that I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation. And it is calling to attention to the whole world that the software industry uses these terms that are potentially offensive. So yeah, it brought more press to the problem. But what I'm hoping to do is that a year from now, when people come join my community, they'll never be aware that this was even part of our nomenclature. They will come in, they will not see these things that are off-putting, and they will join our community having never known that this was a problem. And that to me is a big win. Now, this last objection here that I want to talk about is one that I simply don't have an answer to. People say to me, and people said this to me today on a mailing list, I don't want to remove hurdles. I had those hurdles. Life was hard for me. I had to walk uphill in the snow to school. Why would I want to remove these hurdles from other people? And frankly, if I have to explain why compassion and empathy is important, I'm probably not the right person to do that. I think that may be outside the scope of this talk. And then, you know, at the very end, you'll get people that are saying this is simply political correctness and nothing else, that this is one of my least favorite terms, that this is simply virtue signaling, that this is simply checking a box. And these people, I cannot argue with them because it just gets angry. And to quote George Bernard Shaw, you don't want to wrestle with a pig because you both get dirty and the pig likes it. So I don't have an answer to this particular objection. Now, another thing that I want to mention as I get to the end of my presentation here is that when I have undertaken these efforts, and I've been doing it in a couple of different projects over the years, the responses are overwhelmingly positive. People saying, I'm glad you're doing this. People saying even, wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. Thank you for building a more welcoming environment. But the human brain is wired such that when we have 100 positive responses and one negative one, we tend to dwell on the negative one. We tend to hear the people criticizing us. And I just want to encourage those of you who are interested in taking on a project like this, that the voices that are positive are overwhelmingly in the majority. And to conclude, I want to mention another thing. I've seen some comments about this in the chat. This is not the only axis on which we measure this particular issue. There's so many other marginalized communities that we should think about when we're choosing nomenclature in our documentation. And I've listed a few of them here. You should avoid ableist terms that refer to disabilities. You should avoid gendered terms if possible. There's a number of discussions within Red Hat about avoiding militarized terms, drug metaphors, religious terms. I will note that the reference that I made 2 slides ago about wrestling with a pig, that could be offensive to a number of people on a number of different reasons. And I left it in there simply to make that point, but it's probably not a great metaphor to use in your documentation. So yeah, it's possible to go overboard on this. It's possible to get so wrapped up in choosing words that you are unable to speak. And that's another objection that you will hear when you start down this road. But I feel like it's worth it. I feel like being kind and welcoming is really at the core of what we do in the open source program office. This is our job. This is our remit. And so this is really important to me. So I'll close with a link to my slides here down at the bottom right. And on that last slide are a number of references that I think, written by smarter people than me that show you the right way to do this. I've referenced the Google style guide, which goes through this in greater detail, and an article by Theo Schlossnagel that some of you might know. There's a great article right there at the top about this that he continues to update over time as more words come on his radar that we might want to reconsider. So I know that was really fast. It's a simple message, and so there's not a lot more to say. But if people have questions or want to discuss further, we do have a few more minutes left. Thank you so much for all of you coming and listening to this.
Thank you very much, Rich. So we're looking at the chat now, and I don't see anybody who had their hand up, so I'm not sure if we have anybody to call on. Right. Josh Burkus had mentioned during the discussion that we should definitely mention the conscious language team, which, Josh, are they on Mojo?
Yeah, he put a link in the chat.
Okay, great.
Yeah, they don't. As far as I know, they don't have their own Mojo page, so we've linked to their documentation. That's a team that has of people from our documentation and publicity departments who have been thinking about this, because one of the things is you get to Rich's next to last slide here of all the things that could possibly need correcting, and you're like, oh my God, I can't think about this. And let me say there's help.
It's overwhelming.
Right? There's a group of people in Red Hat who is going through this list of things and saying, okay, how much of a problem is this word really? And what are the things we could replace it with? And so you don't need to make all these decisions on your own. I mean, another piece of advice I would give you there is start with the things that someone already complained about, rather than trying to imagine everything that you might need to correct.
Okay. Do we have anybody else who wants to raise their hand in chat and get a question to Rich, or have a point to add to the discussion?
All right. Well, thank you
We
all
have
for.
one from M. Rashish. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, so I find that a lot of these discussions invite like really toxic people. Do you think it's worth it?
They do. These discussions definitely invite toxic people. And when I made this change specifically to the Apache web server, it occurred to me to just make the change and move on with life. But it seemed important to actually make a statement about it, because making the statement is aimed not at those toxic people, but at the folks who are looking at your community and thinking, is this a place where I'm going to feel welcome? And saying that this is something that's important to us is itself a welcoming statement. So yeah, in this conversation, I have had a number of really horrible things said to and about me on Twitter. And thinking through how you're going to respond to those objections is really, I think it's important. I think it's good to know what sort of objections people are going to make and why they're objectively wrong, really. I mean, there are a lot of people that are just making the argument because they want to argue or because their own supremacy is threatened by these kinds of changes. I still think it's important for us as open source advocates and, specifically as Red Hat, to make these kinds of statements.
Josh, you had a point to add about this as well?
Yeah, as a practical standpoint, having gone through, like Rich, changing this language in an older project that involves lots of contributors who are men in their 50s or 60s. One thing that we found out is, yes, we got a bunch of toxic responses. 95% of those were for people who never contributed to the project in their lives anyway.
That's true. You
can basically just ignore those. If you can have the discussion in a moderated forum, you can even not allow them to appear. The remaining ones, I mean, I'll tell you, at the end of the language change process, we actually kicked somebody out of the project. And this was actually exposure because it turns out that he had been doing bad stuff in private messages anyway, which we found out through the language change process. Like, he'd been insulting people in private messages anyway, and they'd been afraid to come forward. So even the toxic response part of things can actually be useful if you can deal with it for the length of time that it happens.
We have one more question come up in chat. And Micah, I was wondering if you could be kind enough to unmute yourself and ask your question in person. You had a good point.
Sure, thanks. I assume you mean my last question.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you were concerned that people might sort of self-censor or avoid speaking up about language that bothers them if they don't think it's necessarily offensive or isn't offensive to more than a very small group of people, because
yes,
they don't want to be accused of slippery slope fallacy or raising false concerns.
You're absolutely right, and I know for a fact that happens, because most of the responses that I got that were from those underrepresented people came to me in private messages, not in the main conversation. And that's why it's so important for those of us with influence, if I might go back to my first slide, those of us who are the middle-aged white men that have the influence and the privilege in these projects. It's why it's so important for us to be the ones to make the first steps here.
Excellent. All right, Rich and Josh, thank you both very much. Rich, thank you so much for your presentation today. As always, very enlightening, certainly much appreciated. We are going to stop at the half hour. There is a session from Project Build that is an all-company call. I've put the link to that in the chat. I certainly encourage everyone here to attend that presentation if they have the time, because it is certainly a related issue and very important right now. So thank you all very much. We appreciate it. The recording of this video will be out on Mojo and YouTube later this afternoon. Until then, take care and be well.